His research centers on the lives of Christians under Muslim rule and their relationships with church hierarchies in Europe and elsewhere. He has also worked on the social history of England and France during the 13th century, focusing on urban life and development. When it comes to historical books, J.J.'s interests lie mainly in liturgical codices from the Middle Ages, and also, happily for us, early modernity, because we have quite a good collection of early modern, less so medieval, because Hopkins has never really, in a dramatic way, collected medieval material, because the second largest collection in the Western Hemisphere is at the Walters in Baltimore. Before enrolling at Hopkins, J.J. was at Princeton University with certification in medieval studies and European cultural studies. His thesis, which I've still not seen.
I can send it to you.
You should send it to me. J.J. is currently a Stern Center curatorial fellow, and so and we're actually going to be this summer, through the help from the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, working together to create our first thorough catalog of our medieval and early modern manuscript collection too. So that'll be very exciting. Our intention is, once we've done that, to have everything digitized and put on the digital scriptorium. So that's something that we hope to have completed in the next year and a half. So lots of interesting things in that direction. Professor Ann Lester, JJ's advisor, has also represented an interest in us organizing a fragmentology, a manuscript fragment workshop here with Lisa Fagan Davis, the director of the Medieval Academy, which I hope we'll be able to do next year. And by the time that happens, JJ will be the world's leading expert on all medieval and early modern manuscripts at Johns Hopkins. And so you should probably also help teach the class.
Yeah.
So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. We have friends here from Johns Hopkins and also from outside. Thanks for coming, especially those who took a pause to their real lives outside of the university to also attend here. I'm very grateful for that. So let's dive right into this. So use this way. Okay. So what started this project for a talk is, once I was taking my students when I was TAing for my advisor down here to look at some medieval books with Earl Havens, right here, Dr. Havens. And a missal caught my attention. It was very well preserved. It was fairly complete. And I was always fond of medieval missals, and I knew that they usually had a crucifixion picture in the canon. And so I flipped through the missal to see where the crucifixion was, and where it should have been, well, there wasn't one. And I sort of said, oh, well, not all of them have to have it, so I put it back in. But then as I was sort of kneeling by the altar at one of the masses, I noticed, like, my modern priest's missal has a miniature of the crucifixion. So there needs to be some trace or something that something was in that book. So upon looking further, as you can see in the central image, I saw that there used to be one, perhaps in the Middle Ages replaced by an early modern one, but it was later removed. But let me tell you a bit more about the manuscript after that. So you can see in the ghost in the central image, if I point here with the little pointer. Let me tell you a little bit more about the missal. So it was made in Paris. It is characteristic, the decoration, these initials in a very tight square box with blue and red with white highlights are very characteristic of the Paris region in bookmaking. At around the late 14th century or early 15th century, it has 391 folios, made by at least 3 scribes with black ink, red rubrications, and decorations with gold and red and blue ink. It is a fairly lavish missal. It is fairly complete. It's only missing the first week of Advent and the calendar. But it only has one significant illustration or image, and it's the miniature for the introit to Easter morning, resurrexit. And this thing is absolutely prodigious. It's tiny. It's absolutely tiny, but it's so precisely done. And this is something that showcases the specialization and skill of late medieval high medieval and late medieval quasi-industrial bookmakers, because this wasn't made in a monastery scriptorium. This was made commercially in the city of Paris. Someone would write down the text in black, someone would rubricate it in red, and then someone different or a team of different people would decorate it. So if you feel like here the border is a bit divorced from this margin bit and the text, it's because this sheet was probably pre-decorated by someone different, and then it was sort of joined by the artist that did the miniature, the historiated initial. So it was a whole team of artists, people specializing in people specializing in letters, people specializing in borders, which came together to make this missal. And due to its lavish nature, though its size is fairly compact, it might have been a traveling missal or a portable missal or a missal for a small altar in an important church or maybe in a bishop's retinue. And it doesn't have much decoration. Certain feasts, which are important, have a bigger initial than usual. And this is Rorati Celi, the introit for Advent, and it has some of the border decorations. And as the canon begins, the Per Omnia Secula Seculorum, which is sort of the first bits of chanting before you get to the canon, is also heavily decorated, and the initial is enhanced. And it's also got excellent musical text. Some of these melodies still used today. For example, starting here, you got what they call the Sursum Corda, Lift Up Your Hearts, Dominus vobiscum et cum spiritum tuum sursum corda. And if that melody sounds familiar to you, it's because you've probably heard it in church. So this is the preparatory prayer before everything is consecrated. But before we talk further about this missal and why it's important, well, it's important for two reasons. Because the presence of that vestige of an early modern insertion in the book signals that the canon miniature had become something more than just a piece of decoration or just a piece of the graphic program. It had become an integral part of the text, not merely an object of aesthetic necessity, but of ritual necessity. So when someone saw in the early modern period trying to use this missal for very interesting reasons, that there wasn't one, they decided to add one from what they had, which was printed material. And second, the continual use of this medieval missal, which was amended in the early modern period after the passing of the Tridentine Missal in the Council of Trent in the Paris region in France, signals that it could have been used by a Gallican priest or some sort of resisting priest that was trying to resist the reforms of the Tridentine Council, as was as often happened in France with the Gallican movement and the Gallican Church. And let's first, before exploring all of these significances, let's see what a missal is for the uninitiated, if there are any in use. So the missal is basically a book with all of the prayers for the Mass. And the Mass goes back to the very first few decades and centuries of Christianity. The first Eucharistic celebrations that we have an account for come from the Bible itself, from the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul, besides, the narrative of the Last Supper, which the Mass is supposedly based on. So in the first account, we have the book of Acts. Paul is in a ship in the Adriatic during a storm, and he is under duress. The crew is under duress, and to sort of pacify the storm and to give thanksgiving, Paul performs what looks like a Eucharistic ritual. And when Paul had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat, and then he distributed to the others. Paul also gives us account of other communities celebrating the Eucharist, especially in the Corinthians, in his letter to the Corinthians, when the Church of Corinth apparently was celebrating the Eucharist not in a very communal way. Every family was bringing its own food, and they were only consuming what they had brought themselves. And he was admonishing them because of this. And here he uses language that is strongly evocative of the narrative of the Last Supper, which is going to be central to every Mass since or the early Christian period. For I have received of the Lord that which which also I have delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup, when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as ye drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show the Lord's death till he come. And this becomes the primary idea at the center of the Mass, that in partaking of this meal, reenacting the Last Supper, and giving thanks, you commemorate this sacrifice. And that later in the Middle Ages, the theology is even updated to recreating the sacrifice in some way at the altar. And it is sort of like the pinnacle of Christian worship in early times. So we don't have books from that time. The early supposed book for a Eucharist, or that contains a celebration for the Eucharist, is the Didache, which in Greek means the teaching of the 12 apostles is its title, which was found in the 19th century. Pretty bad state. I wouldn't want to be the conservator who had to deal with that. But we were able to read most of it, and it's basically a sort of catechism or manual that has instructions on baptism, the other ancient ritual of the church, the Eucharist, and behavior as a Christian. And it has a section of the Eucharist. Now, concerning the Eucharist, give thanks this way. First, concerning the cup. We thank thee, our Father, for the holy vine of David thy servant, which you made known to us through Jesus thy servant. To thee be the glory forever. And concerning the broken bread, we thank thee, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you made known to us through Jesus thy servant. To thee be the glory forever. Even as this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let thy church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into thy kingdom. For thine is the glory and the power through Jesus Christ forever. Now, even though some scholars believe this is an account of an early Eucharist, such as Andrew McGowan, who has published very recently an excellent book on ancient Christian worship. He's the dean at Yale Divinity School currently. Not everyone is sure that this is really a Eucharistic ritual, because it doesn't have the Last Supper narrative, as Paul mentions it in the letters. It is merely a thanksgiving that resembles more the prayers of thanksgiving coming down from the Jewish traditions given in community meals, such as the meal in the Shabbat and the Passover meal, rather than the Eucharistic meal. But even then, the consensus is that the ritual aspect of the Eucharist was not really set in stone back in the day. House churches would have readings of scriptures for some time, not with a predetermined program. They would have prophesizing, spontaneous prayer. The Didache speaks of prophets, people who have the authority to pray spontaneously without any texts aiding them. And then they would gather together, give thanks, with some spontaneous prayers, or perhaps also using some prescribed ones, consecrate and give thanks to the bread. So let's zoom into the into the late antique period, because the medieval missal, the prayer that will become the center of it, is the Roman canon. A series of prayers and consecrations, formulas developed in late antique Rome. Even though they originate in Rome, they would end up being sort of the standard Eucharistic prayer throughout much of Europe, without much variance. We know that by the 4th century, the canon was more or less developed. We don't have any surviving Mass texts from that time, but we have several quotations of this text by Ambrose of Milan and other church fathers. Ambrose of Milan quotes approximately half, or more than half, of the Roman canon as we see it today, and it is possible that it was more or less complete at that time, and it's possible that it wasn't. We don't really have evidence for it. By the 7th century, however, we do have attestation that the canon is more or less complete. It is a very long text, which in the center has the Passover narrative, and it's enshrined by the Passover narrative, the Last Supper narrative, is enshrined by several prayers and exhortations and commemorations of the saints, prayers for the living, prayers for the dead, prayers of thanksgiving, and prayers of God for acceptance of the sacrifice. And in the canon is attributed to many authors. Some say that it started by Pope Damasus I, that Gregory the Great, Gregory I, had a hand in modifying the canon and composing it in some way, and some even attribute it to Jerome, but precise authorship is uncertain. And it became the subject of lavish decoration in later books in the early Middle Ages. Here we have a Te Igitur initial from the Drogo Sacramentary, Te Igitur being the first words of the canon in Latin, Te Igitur Clementissime Pater, therefore we, merciful Father, humbly pray thee, so on and so forth. And back then, they didn't have missals yet, or books of the Mass. They had sacramentaries, which had all of the sacraments, but you had to use other books for the Mass. But it became a very popular sort of motive in art. And one of the reasons was because early medieval commentators and liturgists and exegetes saw as somewhat providential that the first letter of the Eucharistic prayer of the canon would be a T, not only because it resembles a cross, but because when taken to its Greek equivalent, the letter tau, it has a numerical equivalent of 300, a number that they saw as symbolic of the Trinity and eventually of the crucifixion of Christ. And they saw the number 300 with other numbers appended to it, appearing in all sorts of places in the Old Testament, in the ages of prophets, in the numbering of people and tribes, and they all interpreted as a prefigurement of salvation in the cross. They also interpreted the sign of the cross, the signing, and the letter tau and its equivalent kinds of letters in Hebrew as the signs that you would put on the doorposts over your dwelling place to avert the angel of death or the final plague of Egypt that would take away your first son. So whomever was marked with the cross in his door or in his forehead or as a Christian would be spared from condemnation. And before the 12th century, as I mentioned before, there were no missals. There were several books that were needed for the Mass because at that time you needed a lot of people and a lot of ritual to celebrate a Mass by the sort of like beginning of the High Middle Ages. You required 3 celebrants, a priest, a deacon, and a subdeacon, and various clerics and minor orders like acolytes, lectors, porters, and many others. In the books you required were the sacramentary, which had the structure of the Mass, the fixed prayers, and the canon of the Mass, the epistolary for the subdeacon to read the first reading, the epistles, the evangeliary for the deacon to read the Gospels out of, and the gradual for the choir or schola cantorum to sing the gradual and the introit and the various phrases and responses that accompany the Mass. And there were also various other books of tropes, of sermons, saints' lives, optional chants and embellishments, and it was different if you were a bishop or a priest celebrating the Mass. So you had all of these books. But by the 13th century, all of these texts and readings and prayers had condensed into a single book, the Missal, mostly because of the advent in popularity of the Low Mass. The Low Mass was a Mass that only required one priest and one assistant to celebrate. And you could not handle that volume of books when you had only 2 people celebrating the Mass. So they packed them all together in one book. And the advent of the Low Mass can be attributed to several factors. It's difficult to say, but a population boom in Europe around the 12th century, which affected both the bourgeois classes and the upper classes and the nobility, it meant that there were more people donating endowments and establishing monasteries, and more people desiring to endow masses for the souls of the departed, for the living, for their families. So, in effect, the economy of salvation was growing, and the people who provided that salvation, the priests, had to keep up with it and do more masses. So while you could only celebrate one high mass per day at a church, you could celebrate several low masses per day in a church if you had several priests who could even do it at the same time. That is why you see medieval churches with multiple side altars, because they would often be used at the same time. However, one priest could only celebrate one mass per day, with certain exceptions in high feasts. So the Te Igitur initial, let's come back to the Te Igitur initial, became a fixture of the Missal. First, starting in many ways as the sacramentaries did, by the T itself being turned into a cross and portraying Jesus. But then it was extracted over time, and it became its own freestanding image. So this is an example from the Abingdon Missal in Oxford, which is from around the time a little bit later than our own Missal here. And these books were very precious. And Earl, if you can show them, you would have to keep them in a box like this. This is a Missal or Bible holder that we have. It's from our collection from Spain from the 15th century approximately. These books were absolutely not cheap, not only because they were comprehensive and long, often with more than 400 folios, but also because
the lock is missing on this, so don't be confused. The locks always break and the keys always get lost.
Oh, Earl, can you get?
Yeah.
Yes. So, and also because of the lavish decoration and materials. And also, many times this would be one of the only books in a church, because it's the book that's got everything you need. And if you got a small rural parish church, you're not celebrating more than low masses most of the time, even for Sunday worship. So they needed that sort of protection. And the difference from of the Missal from other books. Oh, and here is a leaf from a Missal that also includes music within it for each of the bits that would have been sung by the choir, which are called sort of like the bits of the gradual. They include the gradual, the introit, the communion, the post-communion, all of these things. The difference with the Missal is that it was still a complex book to operate, because it wasn't a book that you could just read through cover to cover. You had to find the readings from the day on one side of the book, and then you had to flip through the proper preface before the canon, and then you had to flip through the canon, and you had to go back and forth, basically. It was not like other devotional books, which you could read from cover to cover, like books of hours. And here we have on the table various examples of books of hours. And just like books of hours, missals initially came in different uses. While the Roman canon was the standard prayer for missals in the Middle Ages, several other prayers around it, several different feasts, several different saints that were commemorated in different days, varied by region. So the first Book of Hours is a very interesting one. I recently just identified as possibly coming from Amiens. It's incomplete, but it's a very unique example. It doesn't have any illustrations, but it has various prayers that I have not previously seen, and you can feel free to open it and flip through it. It's a very old book, but it's not that fragile. And the second ones are also typical books of hours of the period, mostly the Hours of the Virgin Mary. So, the genre of the crucifixion page survives until the early modern period, into the Tridentine Missal, which was published first in 1570, and we have two very big, beautiful Venetian copies here. And it persists to this day. This is a Roman Missal from 2010, the 2010 translation used in Britain. This photo is courtesy of one of my priest friends in London, who still uses, the crucifixion image and, the same canon, just translated to English. Now, where is the Garrett 17 crucifixion? And that was the animating question of part of this talk. And part of it is, it's missing, but it's left a trace. So here we have an imprint or a ghost image of an early modern woodcut of the crucifixion that was obviously not original to this medieval missal. Now, why an original image might be missing, that's, it's very much unknown. I haven't done the choir analysis in this book. The binding sort of doesn't permit it, but it's possible that the image might have been damaged or worn down and then it was replaced. It's also possible that it might have not been made with an image, since this is a very small and portable missal despite its lavish decoration. And I managed to track down which woodcut illustration produced this effect. And this image was printed in Paris in 1782 by a printer called Jacques Carver, and this image came with the new Tridentine Missal that the Council of Trent had just given Carver the right to publish.
What was the date again?
It's 1582. So 1582, this edition. Carver had produced a couple of missals earlier, but this is the edition that corresponds to our image. And if I flip it through some digital trickery, we can see that it corresponds almost perfectly. The knees are bent in the same way. The cross at the bottom is mirrored here. The Magdalene, the Mary Magdalene, is at the foot of the cross in precisely the same way. The scene corresponds perfectly and agrees with the making of both images. The missal was made in Paris and probably used around Paris. This was printed in Paris. What the image doesn't have is the text below the woodcut, and this could be due to several reasons. It could be that someone obtained a separate woodcut without the missal and stuck it in. You can still see lines of glue where it used to be. It wasn't bound within the book, it was just pasted on. So it was done pretty quickly by its owner. Or it's possible that since that the process of printing left the type less wet or fresh than the image itself. And it's possible that the imprint was produced very much shortly after the image was made, unless the ink can be somewhat reactivated by moisture. Earl, do you think that would be something that could happen?
It could be that it was tipped in before it was completely dry.
Yeah.
And then you have the ink migration.
Yeah.
Or there's something about this particular vellum that is inclined to ink migration.
Yeah.
Just as a process of aging.
Mm-hmm.
But we'd have to really ask an expert conservator about that.
Yeah. So it's unclear when exactly then that ink migration happened, but it's pretty suggestive that this image was placed here shortly after this was printed, or at least very recently. And let's just talk about this missal a little bit. It was a Tridentine missal printed by Jacques Carver in Paris in 1582 at the Rue de Saint-Jacques under the sign of the Unicorn. The Rue de Saint-Jacques was for a long time, and would be for a long time, the center of printing in Paris. And at that time, Paris had more than 200 printing houses. Jacques Carver was one of them. And nearby, since it's in the Latin Quarter, in the Middle Ages, it also would have been a center of book manufacture and book production. You would have the Rue de Parchementerie, the street of the parchment makers, the Rue d'Écrivain, the street of the scribes. And that sort of localization evolved into accompanying printed books. So it's a decently illustrated missal with a few woodcuts in important feasts in the canon and in the printer's device. And now let's talk a bit about the Currer House, because they are a bit interesting. So it always specialized in the printing of religious books, and it was started in Paris by a German immigrant, Thielmann Curver, in 1497. And then it was run by Thielmann's widow, Yolande Bonhomme, who herself came from a prominent printing family between 1522 and 1557, which after Thielmann's death. And Yolande, she's the typical widow who inherits her husband's business in the Renaissance, or in the medieval city, in the medieval trade. But she's quite remarkable in her own right. She was the first woman in 1526 to print a complete edition of the Bible. And she also printed various popular devotionals and books of hours, over 200 titles during her lifetime. And the letters that survive from her dealings suggest that she was personally involved in many of the choices made. She wasn't a typesetter, but she supervised a team of various printers. She owned 5 presses, so she probably had a team of over 75 people to man these presses. And her books of hours were so renowned that they were purchased by the nobility of Paris and even exported to other parts of Europe. She printed in the use of Paris, in the use of Rome, and in the uses of various French cities and in various European cities. And after her death, the printing business passed to her son, Jacques Carver, who was the son also of Thielman, who in 1564 was granted exclusive rights by the king and by the Popes Pius V and Gregory XIII, to print all of the books, all of the bulls, and all of the documents that came from the New Tridentine Council. This was an extremely lucrative, very lucrative acquisition of rights, and it was so lucrative that the various printers of Paris tried to challenge it through the Parlement, the chief court of France, and they asked the Parlement to revoke the privilege that Thielman had to be the only printer of these books. But the Parlement upheld his rights. However, he limited the amount of money he could charge for the books to 50 sous per missal, for example. And this is pretty sensible, because if you have a monopoly, you can pretty much charge whatever you want. And this was printing for Paris, but it was also printing for the rest of Europe, as we saw by the production of the Carver House, as their books were being exported to other parts of Europe, to Southern Europe and Rome, to the west of Europe, and even some made their way to England. So these are...
Maybe just, going back to the last slide, I'll just interject that the Carver printing house possessed great privilege because it was one of the longest survived presses of that late incunabula period to the 17th century. There's only a handful of other printing presses that lasted that long, or printing shops that lasted that long. Aldus, obviously, the Giunta Press in Florence, and Carver. So that's interesting, that connection that you're observing in that sense.
Yes. And also, why would you give a monopoly to a press? Why wouldn't you let everyone print the missal? Because if you're trying to reform the whole church and print one missal for all of Europe, it's easy to have a small number of localized purveyors, so that if anything goes wrong, you know who did it, and you don't have people sort of counterfeiting missals or messing with the text. Because the Council of Trent was controversial. It basically meant that every major town, which had their own way of celebrating the Mass, of keeping their calendar, had now to be subjected to the use of Rome, or something very closely resembling the use of Rome. So all regional missals were abrogated, with certain exceptions for the use of the Tridentine missal. And I'm just going to show you some examples of the printing of the Carver House. So this is Hours of the Virgin Mary, partially illuminated, so a book of hours, but printed by Thielman Carver. And this is an illuminated vellum copy of the same book. It's roughly the same image, but slightly different. More lavishly illuminated. Some of the pages, the ones with illustrations, printed on vellum, not paper, also printed by Thielman Carver sometimes later. And this is absolutely wonderful. It's a book of hours, use of Paris, printed by his widow, Yolande, who you can see in the signs of the unicorn. There are no, the name of Thielman Carver is no longer being used, but his sign is still used by his widow. But since she's not, him, she's just using his symbol. But it's, beautifully colored and illuminated with gold paint. And this was owned by Anne de Montmorency, the Duke de Montmorency, and yes, the guy was named Anne. I had never encountered a medieval guy named Anne before, or an early modern one, and this was the first time that I did, but, it's very interesting. He was commemorating one of his ancestors, apparently, by that. And, there are 3 editions known of the Carver Missal that we have. We have his first edition from around 1574, which had a more elaborate and bigger image of the crucifixion. It was a much bigger book. And we have an edition from 1578 that I know exists, but I was not able to find pictures between various auction houses and libraries. And then we have the last missal that he printed a year before his death in 1582, which provided the image that gave our missal its canon miniature. He also produced other missals that were not the Tridentine missal and that were lavishly illuminated. This is the Premonstratensian missal, which is used by the Order of Norbertine Canons. Orders had their particular rites like the Dominicans and the Norbertines and the Franciscans, and they were allowed to keep for their community use their rites. And since Thielman and Jacques and his family had a great reputation for printing liturgical books, the abbot of the Premonstratensians in Paris also gave him the privilege of printing all of his books. However, that was a much more limited market because you're selling to a monastic order. But why would you be using medieval missal in France after the passing of the new missal by the Tridentine Council? Well, it is not surprising to anyone that Europe was undergoing a lot of turmoil with the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation at this time. And that did not only involve England and the German lands, it also involved France pretty heavily. You have first what is called the Gallican crisis, or the Gallican movement, which originated during the Great Schism of the 14th and 15th centuries, when the papacy took up residence in Avignon after the King of France ordered, or his associates ordered, the kidnapping and eventual death of Pope Boniface VIII. Whether the death was deliberate or not remains debatable. But when the King of France took that assault on the papacy, the popes became pretty much heavily influenced by the French state. They were elected Frenchmen, and they moved to the Palais des Papes in the city of Avignon. And if you've ever drank Châteauneuf du Pape, Châteauneuf du Pape, the new castle of the Pope, that's where that wine comes from. The popes there planted those vineyards. So during that period, the French church secured privileges from the king to elect their own prelates and to avoid papal taxes. These were called the Gallican liberties. There was also a form of royal Gallicanism, which established that the King of France was not subject to any other ruler, not even the Pope. Therefore, the French king and the clergy would act together as a limiting influence of the Pope's undue power in France. This was sort of similar to the move that had been taken in England by Henry VIII without a definitive break with Rome. It was sort of like a soft distancing, but it was never strictly enforced or enforced by law. It was always in a series of documents and concordats. The liberties were confirmed in 1438 by Charles VII in the Pragmatic Sanctions of Bourges, but Francis I largely ignored these rights. In 1516, at the Concordat of Bologna, he sought to sort of endear himself to the papacy, so he allowed for the Pope to start collecting taxes again on the French clergy, and to allow for the interference of the Pope and the King in the election of bishops and abbots. When the Council of Trent began in 1545, French ambassadors and bishops largely boycotted it because the clergy of France saw it as an affront to the liberty of their church, to their Gallican liberties. And for much of its history, it was spurned by the French. Even after its reconvening in 1550, the King of France, Henri II, condemned it at this time, and the bishops of France did not participate. Because the Council of Trent, what it sought to do was to make a uniform liturgy and several other reforms in the Catholic Church. So, effectively giving Rome the power to dictate how everyone prayed throughout all of Europe. But after the outbreak of war in 1562, the French reluctantly participated in the council as France was divided between a significant contingent of Calvinists, the Huguenots, and Catholics in the conflict known as the French Wars of Religion. And that sort of division made Catherine de' Medici at the time, who was the regent of France, want to approach the papacy and reconcile with it further. And the Paris region was a very important center in the French Wars of Religions and the Gallican crisis, because it was always deemed as a Catholic loyalist center. It was sort of at the center of a tug of war between the Gallicans and the Ultramontanists. The Ultramontanists from Ultramonte, from beyond the mountains, they supported the Pope. But it was largely a city full of clerics that supported the reforms from the Pope. So it's even more significant to find that a Parisian missal would belong possibly to a dissenting cleric, to a cleric that did not want to start using the new missal. And there are various reasons why you wouldn't want to use the new missal. It diminished a lot of the French identity in the liturgy. So let's take some screenshots from, or some pictures from the missal that we have, the Garrett 17th. So this is the feast of Saint Louis, King of France, Louis IX, who was King of France in the late 13th century. It's celebrated on August the 25th. And this is a very special Mass for the Gallicans. It legitimizes divinely the authority of the French king by having a saint in the lineage. It is a symbol of the sacred kingship of the King of France. And it begins with, an introit which starts with Gaudeamus. The missal is telling you here to go to another page where the introit is more complete. That they did to reduce size and space. But they have a large collect. But the highlight of this liturgy is the sequence. Here, starting at sequentia, regem regum veneremur. Let us praise the King of Kings, and from kings let us glory in the glory of Louis. And so this is an elaborate poem in Latin that goes on for several stanzas and takes on a large part of the liturgy, and sequences were only afforded to the most important feasts in a missal. One sequence that you guys might be familiar with is the Dies Irae in a Requiem Mass. Dies Irae, Dies Irae, Day of Wrath and Day of Mourning. So he had a great commemoratory sequence, a very grand thing to put in someone's liturgy. Now, the new missal, the Tridentine missal, first of all, they give Louis the introit of a common confessor. He used to have an introit of greater glory, and now he's just given the glory that all of the saints that are not martyrs are given. So he's not special anymore, and there is no sequence to be found. He is just one more saint, not special to France. So you can see why the Gallican Church, proud of its heritage and proud of its association with the monarchy, would refuse to use the Tridentine missal and continue using the missal that I've shown you, even if it means repairing it, even if it means repairing it with modern printouts. Now, another thing that is important about the image, besides indicating that the missal was still used possibly as a resistance, movement of liturgical resistance, is that the fact that the image is there. And I was attracted to this little detail here, the cross beneath the cross. I was puzzled, like what does this mean exactly? This is clearly not part of the composition, at least not part of the scene. And then I said, where have I seen this before? And then I remembered that similar devices are found in medieval missals. And I first remember seeing the Abingdon Missal, which is an exhibition at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And these small crosses have been studied before, especially in the work of Catherine Rudy to some extent, and they're called osculatory targets. And that's just a fancy word for place where you should kiss the book. Why? Because a private devotion of kissing the image of Christ before saying the canon had begun to become a standard in the liturgy, and illuminators, to avoid the image being ruined by the constant kissing and rubbing of the face of the priest, would give them another place to kiss and rub out instead. You can notice that all of these crosses have signs of wear in them. This one has illumination. You can't see it very well, but it has gold flaking off of it. This one was painted on. It wasn't gilded, but with gold paint. It's fading quite dramatically. And the feet of Christ here, which was a common place to kiss the image, here are almost, completely gone. And even the image here, like this priest didn't care that he had a target. He kept kissing the feet of Christ, and you can tell because the grease from his nose, from the tip of his nose, has permanently stained the legs of Christ. And you can tell it's a grease stain because it makes the vellum more transparent. You know, when you've sort of like wetted paper with oil, or it makes it more transparent. And this is present in every sort of copy that I've made. This is a missal, what they call an abbreviated missal. So it's supposed to be large text, probably for a bishop because it was from the Cathedral of Beauvais. a bishop that was elderly and couldn't read too well. It doesn't have all of the readings, but it has the canon, and it has the image in a small format, protected by a cloth, trying very hard to keep this image integral. And we can see the osculatory target has been completely worn out. You don't have any of the gold. You only have the blue clay in the background of the gold. But even then, someone with a profuse devotion to the Apostle John has rubbed, kissed, I don't know, licked the image? I don't know what happened here. But this happens. Even in the most humble, like, this is very cool. This is an original cloth cover, and it could be for protection. Some people have suggested to me that it could also be for veiling during Passion Tide, when they cover all the images in the church. I think it's mostly for protection, but this is just, yeah, and you can see his face is stained by face grease from the priest, and yeah, it's just in such a dire state, but it means that the missal was used in various occasions and that the users were very devout. And it's funny because the book itself echoes itself in the books that, like, why would you be holding books at the crucifixion of your son and your master?
And when you look at the very top of the image, which is perfectly preserved,
Yeah.
the red and the gold corners, you really do see by contrast.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and there's also Sol and Luna, which are very, the sun and the moon, very ancient symbols of eternity and witness to the crucifixion of Christ, like a cosmic witnesses. And these are extracted from the book Touching Parchment by Catherine Rudy. You have even more egregious examples like this. The crucifixion was often paired with an image of the Father sitting on his throne, or the Majestas, which is an image of Jesus sitting on his throne. And they were all kissed, even though they had targets. Some priests didn't care. Here's a donor portrait. The donor has been caught in the crossfire here. And even when you didn't have miniatures, you can tell around the T, the te igitur, which gave rise to the motif of the cross, there is significant rubbing and kissing. I mean, you can't see it really well, but at this corner, you can even see the fingerprint of the priest in ink that has run out because of the moisture. So they're just handling these images constantly, and you can see the corners of parchment. They're just so worn out. And even the most humble missals, this is a Carthusian missal, so they're supposed to be Cistercians, kinds of Cistercians. This missal doesn't have really any imagery or gold or decoration beyond fancy penwork and paint. But even then, someone felt that they needed to add a small crucifixion just below the te igitur, the start of the Eucharistic prayer. And even then, you have evidence here that the tip of a nose was introduced into this book at some point. So they saw this as a necessity almost, and we can tell that it was sort of a ritual necessity for the priest, because in examples like this, so this is a missal for the laity. It's in French. It's a hand missal. It was probably owned at some time by Henry VIII. This has a storied list of owners. It's also kept in the Beinecke, and it's known as the Yale Missal. Despite all of its lavish decoration, it has a number of miniatures and illustrations in every feast of note. There is no crucifixion image next to the canon, because it wasn't necessary for the faithful to sort of venerate the image for the celebration of the Mass. Even then, when you go to the canon here, when you're supposed to say, "This is my body," instead you get this phrase, "Si ne sont pas mis la parole du sacrament du corps." Here are not placed the words of the sacrament of the body. They refuse to write down, "This is my body," or they refuse to write down, "This is the chalice of my blood," because these words are just too sacred for anyone to utter in the vernacular tongue. So you don't need to give them to the laity. So the laity doesn't need the words of consecration. And those precise words, by the way, at that point are believed to be the moment in which transubstantiation happens, and the bread and wine are turned into the body and blood of Christ. So it's just not a ritual element. So all of this points out to the fact that the crucifixion miniature was not only an element of decoration. It wasn't not just only an evocation of the shape of the T. It was a part of the text itself. It was a ritual necessity of the book, and the veneration of said image was deemed as an integral part of the ritual, mostly to show respect to God, but since the Mass is considered to be a sacrifice, looking at the image and venerating it would put the priest in the mindset that he is again before the foot of the cross, recreating in a way, mystically, across time, the sacrifice of Christ in his altar. And that sort of veneration would help him center himself, put himself in that mindset, situate himself in that historical, mystical, and cosmic space, and proceed with the ritual. Now, this practice, even though the osculatory target was preserved in printed books, seems to have died down pretty much by the 17th century. The crosses ceased to be placed in the books, and the books ceased to show signs of grease. You can still find some kissed and greased up books, but not that many in the early modern period. But the phenomenon of the image remains, and modern missals still present the crucifixion image. And what do I want to say by this? I want to say that the image is not only decoration, it's part of the whole choreography, the whole ritual, the whole necessity of the Mass, because the book itself, it's not just a book, it's an artifact, it's a powerful object that by its text, by its ability to instruct, to consecrate, by its sacred images that it bears, must be treated with reverence, stored properly. Even how you move the missal around the altar is regimented by rubrics. And in that way, we can look at this book beyond more than a book, but also as an artifact of religious devotion. People could swear oaths on the image of the cross. That is some other research that has been done. And they could use it for venerations of the image. And in short, just to conclude, I hope you can now see that illustration, especially in religious books, serves more than a purpose of decoration or devotion. Sometimes it is the ritual itself, and can point to the mindset and the devotional practices and the mystical and cosmic preoccupations of those that celebrated liturgy in the Middle Ages, and how liturgy defined identity either nationally or by orders, and beyond just a series of routines. It's actually a very useful source for the history of the book, for the history of religion, and for the history of society in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Thank you.
Questions, thoughts?
These are Alice Warder's books before she married Garrett.
Yeah, she collected medieval books. Not a lot, but I think she just liked beautiful books. And even after they married, they conjoined their names on book plates for the very special things that they bought together.
These are not the very special.
These are not. She bought them when she was younger, and maybe she just didn't have as much money. I don't know. But they're unusual books. I mean, the two farther away from me are very humdrum, like standard fare, middle of the road books of hours. No, these two in the middle of the table. And then this other one is a bit nicer, but it's partial, and so it's got its problems too. But again, we just never collected medieval. In fact, most of the medieval codices we had came from the private collection of the Garrett family.
So that's the one that has the ghost image in it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, we just this week received a gift of a late medieval antiphonary. So that's kind of how the collection gets built, right? I mean,
So you're retired.
yeah. What I do is I buy leaves.
Be careful.
Yeah, but I buy them especially when there's clear evidence that they've been broken up for a very long time. But there are only like two major booksellers for medieval material: Sandra Heinemann, who used to teach here in the History of Art department, and Jorn Gunther, who is in Germany.
I think that's where Darwin got those images, and they were stolen, those leaves.
it's when you get to the real masterpieces, it's a real problem. We just acquired a beautiful leaf from a German antiphonary, which has a curious representation of the three Marys for a special presentation to somebody later in the year. So we're going to keep the manuscript leaf. So that's kind of how we've done it. And I've also, one of the really interesting ways to collect medieval materials, if you don't have a budget of $5 million a year, like the Beinecke has to buy beautiful books of ours, is to buy binding waste fragments.
Like the one with the German.
Yeah, like with the Neum notation. And I've gotten like a late Carolingian one because it's a nice exemplar of that paleographical tradition. And so yeah, when something really unusual comes up, that's when we kind of go for it. Yeah.
I have a question about the sequences. I don't know.
Yes.
But in the Tridentine ones, they were removed because the church felt that they were anti-Semitic.
Some of them, and they also thought that they were excessive in some regions. They wanted to trim down sort of like which feasts had sequences, and they ended up just giving sequences to feasts of the Virgin Mary, the feasts of major apostles, and some sequences because they were not extracted from the Bible. They were written by contemporary people, and anti-Semitism reached a peak in Europe in the High Middle Ages. It's very probable that many of them were also anti-Semitic, but the one about Louis was not particularly anti-Semitic. It just sort of compared him to. It was very similar to one by Francis, and it just exalted him. And they sort of said, well, if we're going to do one missal for all of Europe, why does all of Europe have to venerate Louis in this way? So sort of, I mean, I don't know the specific reasoning, but that's sort of like what I am picturing from it. But the church did it again in 1962 when they revised the missal, not when we have the modern missal. This was still a Latin missal, but they also got rid of even more sequences because they thought, okay, this is excessive, and they got. There are 6 left, exactly, and they got rid of a bunch of octaves, and they got rid of a bunch of feasts classifications. They always, because the calendar gets cluttered. You get more saints, people worship practices change, so you have to change that. But sometimes you impose change top down over all of Europe, and some people get angry about it.
Well, you need to add new saints too. You need room.
Yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, I have a question. I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much. And one of the things I really enjoyed was your lovely voice filling the room.
Thank you.
I was wondering, this is something I've always wondered about, and I've never looked it up. How stable is music notation at this point?
So
maybe just in a church setting. But.
In a church setting, so there is a huge diversity of melodies. Like I can almost never find two antiphonaries that have exactly the same melodies all of the time. But there are melodies that are popular. A popular melody is this melody that we saw for the Sursum Cordam, Dominus vobiscum. Other popular melodies are the Veni Creator Spiritus, so Veni Creator Spiritus. They're still sung today, and why they become renowned and famous, I don't know. But it's sort of on a case-by-case basis, but it can be very stable.
I think cathedral use might help to canonize a particular.
Yeah, or if it's used in Rome, a lot of the melodies that survive into this day are the ones that were chiefly used by Rome and then were just promulgated over all of the church.
This Sursum Corda is a tiny bit different to the modern one, though.
Yeah.
In its closing sort of cadences, they're slightly different.
Yeah.
They tend to go up rather than down in this one.
Yeah.
If you want to see all the variants, there's a site called Diam.
Yeah.
You probably use that.
Yeah.
And also the Cantus.
The Cantus website.
There, which is growing all the time.
Yeah, I use it to identify the sequence for this missal and see which other books have it. The Louis IX sequence.
Are they like national hero saints that get these sequences?
Yeah.
Does Santiago de Matamoros get a sequence?
I don't know if he does, but Thomas More wouldn't get a sequence because he was canonized late. And that was sort of an early practice. But people like Edward the Confessor had a
Right.
sequence in the rite of English, in the English use, which people call the Sarum rite, but I prefer to call it English use. Um, um, yeah, I mean, important regional saints like Saint Geneviève in Paris would also have sequences. And you know that a missal is Parisian because you open the calendar, January 2nd feast, Saint Geneviève, and you're like, use of Paris. But then when you're trying to do a global church, like a pan-European church that uses one missal, and only the saints that everyone thinks are important get sequences. So the apostles, the Virgin Mary, certain early martyrs like St. Stephen. But
So before there were kingdoms of Europe,
Yeah.
per se.
yeah,
Anyone else? This process of redaction and book resistance, it's is very interesting. It also happened in convents, and
Mhm.
many of you know we have this fabulous collection of early modern books about women, women religious in particular, and we have numerous liturgical texts owned by convents where slip cancels have actually been glued over
Yeah.
passages in the Tridentine reforms and then written over to restore language from the pre-Tridentine tradition.
yeah.
And the use of slip cancels was really fairly common. We also have a fabulous very interesting early manuscript copy. It was 1590, I suppose, from a Bruges convent. They copied the Tridentine liturgical texts into a manuscript
Mm-hmm.
so that they could change it back.
Yeah.
But see how much they could retain of the new Tridentine
Mhm.
that was not inimical of what they wished to do
Yeah.
as a community, because they did have the privilege of making some determinations for themselves as a community, at least in terms of their order, their rules, and so. So, I think this idea that Tridentine liturgy is this monumental thing is very difficult to really establish, even centuries later.
Yeah.
And that resistance is not exclusively French, even though the Gallican Church is infamous for its assertion of autonomy.
Mhm.
So I think that's, and I don't know a lot of studies of that, like of that kind of bookish resistance. But I think it would make a very interesting study.
Yeah. I
One
think
more
so
question.
too. Yes.
Sorry. So have you
Yeah.
compared the Gallican to, say, the Benton or the Coptic or you mentioned the Ambrosian, I think you mentioned the Sarum, these Mozarabic, which is really crazy.
Yeah.
It's so difficult to read and transcribe.
So, the Gallican Rite. So there's a confusion between Gallicanism and the Gallican Rite, because the Gallican Rite is the sort of like late antique, sort of early medieval French use that sort of gets supplanted when the Roman canon becomes widespread. I didn't look at that one, but I did look at the Sarum Rite, or the use of the Cathedral of Salisbury, because there's a lot of debate about how widely it applies, but the use of the Cathedral of Salisbury. I didn't look at any Eastern rites because I was sort of focusing on the Latin tradition. Though that would be interesting. There's a big book by Joseph Jungmann, who was a Jesuit, on the history of the Roman Mass that compares some of that. So it would be a good place to start. And with the Mozarabic rite, I would have liked to look at it. It's a bit more similar it's more Latin because it's part of the Latin Church, but I didn't look at that one. I sort of focused on Northern Europe. So I compared this to the use of Rome, the Tridentine use, and the Sarum use, and some of the other uses of France, like the uses of Rouen and places like, not Amiens, in southern France.
Well,
Yeah.
someone asked the question about the stability of the music, and if you look, for example, at the same chant in Ambrosian
Mhm.
and in Gregorian traditions, you find that what's simple in the Gregorian is complex in the
Yes,
Ambrosian.
and the Ambrosian chant is famous for its
Yeah.
complexity
Very-
and
very
mhm.
ornate,
Yeah, and the Episcopal Church actually sometimes uses Ambrosian chant because they like to pick from different traditions and use it. I've heard it sort of sung before.
I'd like to suggest that we continue this conversation over a civilized glass of champagne, as is our custom. We have a nice little reception with food and drink at the Tudor and Stuart room. And if you just follow Rachel, she will be the Pied Piper and will take you to a small feast that we put together. But before we do that, I think our speaker deserves one more.
And sorry for